This tutorial is going to cover an interesting geometry type in Rhino. This is Rhino 7, and in addition to surfaces and poly surfaces and meshes, there's another type of geometry called subdivision surfaces, or SubD surfaces. This type of geometry is useful for modeling smooth geometry and complex curvature relatively easily. It's like modeling in clay versus solid geometry. So I'll go over the basics of this and cover some primitives and how it can be used and how it can aid in any workflow. So under the normal Rhino screen, you'll see the SubD tools. This is a tab, one of many that come in Rhino 7. So in the SubD tools tab, you'll see there's a set of primitives here. Now each of these is similar to a Rhino poly surface or a surface where we can click and drag to create any number of geometries. So a plane, a cone, a truncated cone, cylinder, a SubD sphere. So clicking. Now with SubDs, there was a previous type of geometry that was similar to this called T-splines, which used to be a plugin for Rhino. SubD geometry is based on three different components. So there's the vertex, which are the corner points of each of the geometry here. They're the edges, which you see here, and the faces themselves. So in SubD, the easiest way to select these is by holding down Shift, Control, and then clicking with a left click. And you're able to select a face independently, right, to manipulate. Using the same keyboard shortcut, Shift, Control, left click, you're able to grab vertices as well. So now I'm manipulating this vertex point. Okay, same thing with edges. Shift, Control, click, and now I can manipulate this edge independently. Okay, so it can be a lot like clay modeling, where you can push and pull and the geometry responds according to its calculus, according to the NURB surface that is being manipulated. So that's kind of the fundamentals of SubD, where you can manipulate the vertex, the edge, or the face of the geometry. And there's filters here. If you want to only select edges, you can do that by clicking on that. And it turns on this selection filter down here, and it makes sure that you're only clicking on edges. This can get difficult to work with, if you want to go back and forth with other Rhino geometry. Same thing with faces. You can select, and this will make sure you only select faces, and you notice that that's showing up here in your selections filter. Same thing with vertices. We can lock that on, so the only thing we'll select now are the vertices. But if we want to disable that, we can just hit disable, and all of the selection filters won't be used. We can then just hit Shift, Control, and then click on any face or edge or vertex that we want. Okay, so those are the different ways of manipulating SubD. And we can click on it and manipulate the whole geometry as well. So similar to control points in a mesh or NURBS, we can manipulate local geometry. So I can click on this and I select the whole SubD, or I can select a portion of it and modify it locally. So for curvilinear geometry and fluid geometry, character animation, this can be a useful tool. So there's a series of primitives that we can select, we can make and manipulate. Again, Shift Control click, and we can modify them. And you'll notice we'll do this torus again, but when you click on it, it'll give you options. So we can select the number of vertical faces or round faces. So we can make this more precise or less precise. I'll make this 20. Make the vertical faces 12. And this will give us more control over the geometry. So the more subdivisions we select, the more control we'll have over the geometry. We can control it in local locations a lot easier. So a box like this can be made. There's also ways to manipulate the primitives once we've created them. Let's say we want to add an edge. We want to have a crease along one of these edges here. There's an add crease command, so we can click on that, and we can click either once to select just one segment, or we can double click and it'll continue that edge all the way around. So I can double click and it'll grab the entire length of the edge. And when we're ready, we hit enter and we'll see that it creates a crease. So if you're only interested in smoothing certain parts of your geometry, this is one solution for that. We can add a crease selectively again, going around the bottom here and hitting enter. And you'll see that it keeps everything else smooth while creating a crease along these edges. Okay, and these can as well, Shift Control click, these can be manipulated the same way as previously shown. So and then if we want to remove the crease, there's also that command. So we can go back, if we double click, this will grab the whole edge and we can hit enter and it'll smooth it back out. So we can go back and forth between smooth and adding creases. Some other important things, let's say we want to add resolution to this geometry. One thing we can do is insert an edge. So let's say we want to manipulate this corner with a little bit more fidelity. We can say insert edge. It's going to ask us which type we would like to do. We'll leave that for now. So this is going to be one of the edges that we duplicate. So you click on an edge, hit enter, and you'll be able to duplicate that edge. So if we want to add precision to this, say we want to manipulate this a little bit more, just repeating that same command, we can add edges and add some resolution to that corner. So that's the insert edge command. And again, it's asking for a curve that's in the same direction. So we'll click on a curve adjacent to the location where we want to add an edge. So let's say we've made these changes, we've modified the geometry. Let's say we delete one of these faces. So we can go delete face, click on some of these and hit enter. So we can make holes in the geometry here. There's also ways to close that back up. So let's say we've created a hole that we want to fill back up. We can use the stitch mesh or SubD edges command. So we click on that, select first vertex or set of edges to stitch together. So in our case, we're going to use two edges here enter, two edges here, enter, and it'll stitch that back up, and we'll be able to determine where the seam will be when we click. Okay, so that's a way to close that back up as well. So there's also a SubD Loft, so we can start this whole process with curves. So if I just draw some NURBS curves, we can loft these curves together and generate a SubD geometry. So I can loft these, click, enter, and it'll simulate a surface that flows through those three curves. So in the same way, I can shift, control, click, and manipulate each of these faces or edges or vertices. All right, so different ways of generating the SubD geometry. We can start with curves, we can start with primitives. Another way to start with curves is to do this Multipipe command. So if I have a series of lines or any other curve, and I'm going to manipulate this to make it three-dimensional. So I can select all of these curves, and then I can run this command SubD Multipipe, and it'll ask for the radius. I'm going to leave that at 2, hit enter, and then it'll ask for how to resolve the ends, and I'm going to say off, leave that off, hit enter, and then this is the strut division. So it's asking me how many times I want to divide each line or each curve here. So we're just dividing it once. Leave that as is and hit enter. So it's going to simulate a pipe that connects all of the curves that we just modeled. So it'll have edges that are resolved and create this 3D geometry that is once again able to be manipulated in SubD. So we can make changes to this. Another really good tool to use if we want to toggle back and forth between the smooth geometry of SubDs and a more easily modeled geometry, we can do this toggle SubD display. So when we click on that, we can toggle between straight edges and SubD smooth edges. So clicking on it again goes back to the smooth view. So again, that's here, toggle SubD display. And with that on, we can, let's say we wanted to close one of these edges. We could simply go to the single SubD face command and click on all 4 edges and generate, hit enter. We'll generate a face at the end of this, and then select the rest of it and type join. So using the join command, you can hit enter, and now this is all one SubD geometry. So now when we toggle back, it now has a closed end to it. So again, shift, control, click, we can pull this face and manipulate it. Right, so the other way to close these is when we first create it, we can specify that the edges are closed. We had that, we set that to off when we created it. So I can do that again, SubD Multipipe, select them, set pipe radius, we'll set it to 3 this time. Cap ends, we'll say on, so now it's gonna close the ends. And strut divisions, we'll set that to 2. We want to see 2 subdivisions. So we're seeing 2 subdivisions, we're seeing the ends are capped, and we're seeing a thicker geometry. Okay, so that's Multipipe, very useful for other, curvilinear geometry, designing bicycles, things like that. So there's also some commands that carry over from the mesh display as well. So we have Bevel Mesh or SubD. So we can take the we could take a face that has a sharp corner, and we can bevel the edge, so round it out. So for example, if we have something like this, we have a SubD, and we have creases around the edge. Let's say we crease these, and then later on we decide, okay, we want to bevel one of these edges. We can go back to Bevel Mesh or SubD. It's going to ask for the edge, and then we're going to manually specify the size and figure out how big the radius is that we want for that portion of the geometry. All right, so that's Bevel Edge. And once we're done modeling, and let's say we want to turn this into a poly surface, something that we can manipulate or bring back into other types of geometry in Rhino, we can select it and we can hit Convert Object to NURBS. It'll ask for some options, and then you'll notice we now have a poly surface. So this could be useful if you're running a Grasshopper script that requires a poly surface or a surface. So I can select that this is now a brep or a poly surface, and I can click on that. I can type explode to break it up into its individual surfaces. So if I had some use for a portion of this, there's a way to do that as well. Okay, so those are poly surfaces. Talked about stitch, convert to SubD, so we can have a Rhino primitive, let's say a box. If I just type box, we can also convert to a SubD. So I can select that, select the poly surface, hit enter, enter, and we'll see that it generates kind of in this case, a crude interpretation of that box. So this is now something that we can manipulate. Again, Shift Control click. So different geometry will convert with different success. This is clearly not what we were looking for, but there's ways to go from mesh and poly surface to SubD as well. Sliding mesh or SubD edge. So we can move these edges. So if we select this, we can actually change the location of these edges. All right, so we can also subdivide the SubD. So if we again want to create more local control, so we can select the whole thing, or if we want to only select certain faces, hold down Shift to select multiple, and then I hit this, I can subdivide only these surfaces or these faces. Okay. It leaves kind of an uncontrolled edge, but this does allow us to have control over a smaller domain here of the surface. So for more precision in that area. Okay, so we can also insert points. So adding points to this. Can also add control. We still, let's see, can disable this. We can also delete faces. We showed that earlier. This is a useful one, bridge meshes or SubDs. So if we wanted to bridge two meshes together, let's say I wanted to duplicate this. So I can click on it, hold Alt, and then using the gumball I can drag it. let's say I wanted to bridge these two surfaces, and you'll see what I mean in a second. So if we hit bridge meshes or SubDs, it's going to ask for either curves or faces. So either edges or faces. Select the same or a similar face on both geometries. Oh, it's asking for the first. So I select that on the first, hit enter, and I select this on the second, hit enter. And it's going to create a bridge between those two geometries. So we can then affect the straightness of that, whether we want it to crease, hit OK. So this creates a tunnel or a bridge between both surfaces. So this can also be seen in our primitive over here. We can hit bridge. It's going to ask for the first set, so I'm going to use 2 in this case. Hit enter. I'm going to try to be as consistent as I can. Let's say we want to move it over though. Let's move it over to here. Click on those 2 and hit enter and enter. So now we have a bridge going through that. So again, this is a very smoothed interpretation of that bridge. So again, we can always add creases to this. We can add precision to it. Again, I can click all the way around and add creases as needed. Okay, so some other things. So fill a SubD hole. So another example of a scenario when, let's say we've deleted a face and we want to fill that hole. Double click to grab the whole edge and hit enter, and it's going to fill that back in. Okay, so this is a more precise way to close up a SubD rather than using the stitch mesh or stitch SubD command. Okay, so let's say we want to give thickness to a shell. Right now this is a hollow geometry. Let's say we want to give thickness to this. We can use the offset SubD command. So clicking on the original pipe geometry here, hit enter. We can set the distance. Let's set this to 0.2. And we can set it to solid. So this will be a closed geometry and both sides no. Let's just leave that and hit enter. So now our SubD does have a thickness. So if we're prototyping and we wanted to see this in its actual material thickness, we can now model that. So again, that's this offset SubD. And if we had turned off solid, this would just be 2 separate SubDs. This wouldn't be a solid here. Okay, so that's the basics of SubD modeling. And again, this type of geometry can be useful for more ergonomic industrial design or just more curvilinear geometry. So hope this was useful, and happy to do more of these. All right, have a good one.